Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to kick this off now. So thank you and welcome to the Flow Power's webinar series. My name is Jamie McDyer. I'm the GM of sales here at Flow Power. We just thought we'd kick off this one, and the topic being how to make the most out of the changing energy market. We thought it was a bit timely, given that we're about to come into summer. There's been a lot of press discussions about volatility and variability in the marketplace. And really, we wanted to kind of spend a bit of time understanding and explaining how companies who understand this can actually use that variability to drive down their energy costs. Before we kick off, though, I'd like to introduce my other co-presenters. With me, I have Aidan.
Hi, Jamie and Jens.
And we have Alex.
G'day, hi all.
So before we actually get into the details, some housekeeping. We're aiming for the session to run about 45 minutes. It's about basically half an hour presentation, and then we have some time for questions at the end. We'd ask you to hold those questions to the end, and we'll go through them through a moderated session. And we'll send out the slides and the recording at the end of the discussion, and they'll be publicized on our YouTube channel and on our website. So in terms of, for those who don't know Flow Power, or this is your first time joining with us, we are an energy retailer. We like to think we're slightly different to the major retailers. One of our fundamental purposes is to try and put customers back in control of their energy spend. We recognize that the market is in transition, and we think that the best way for the market and for all of us is for customers to be in control and start to look at how they can manage energy rather than just buy it as an overhead or procurement. In terms of the agenda, we're going to start off very quickly with some of the things that are going on in the market, try and explain that at a very high level. And we'll talk about some ways that customers can actually take advantage of that variability to drive down their costs. We will finish up with a case study and try and make it real with a real customer example, and then we'll open it up to questions. So without going into any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alex, who will kick us off on the market.
Thanks, Jamie. So one of the things that we've noticed over particularly the last couple of years, is that Australia's energy market is very much changing. In fact, you might have seen coverage in the media. They're often talking about how the market is in transition. And what that means is that we've seen the market, which was traditionally quite static, a very stable market, is becoming much more dynamic. And there's a great deal of variability in the market. We're seeing an increased uptake of renewable generation. We're seeing traditional coal-fired assets close, and there's become this disconnect between supply and demand. And all of that's well and good. That's discussed in energy circles. But what we really want to talk about today is, what does it actually mean for the customer? How can you, as an energy consumer and user, take advantage of this changing market? What we're looking at here is a graph showing the average quarterly prices in the underlying energy market, and we're looking at that for South Australia for nearly the entire history of the electricity market. Today in this presentation, we're going to look at data associated with South Australia, but the same concepts apply no matter where you are in the NEM in the Australian market. So you can see, apart from a few events that happened, for example, when the carbon tax was in play, and when there was a NEM-wide drought in 2007, 2008 that had a great impact on prices, we saw quite static, stable pricing for a long time. And then in the last 3 years, really beginning in early 2016, there's been some very big changes in the market. We've seen a number of coal-fired stations close, including the last of the remaining coal-fired generation in South Australia. Hazelwood was a very large coal station in Victoria that closed. And we've seen this really quite significant increase to high pricing, and in what we're calling is the new normal, that's the shape of the underlying market. What we're also seeing is, as you can see in the last 3 years, quite significant swings between quarters, and that represents a difference between summer and winter pricing. So we're not seeing a stable, static price all year. We're seeing a great deal of variability throughout the year, which is something that is relatively new, other than those drought years. So one thing that I want to dive in deeper is that's all well and good to talk about how the price has increased in the last couple of years. but we've also seen that the spread of prices are different. So this graph is showing it's a box plot without the extremes. So we're looking at the 25th percentile and the median range being the gap between the orange and the aqua color. And then the 75th percentile is the top of that orange bar. So looking at the last 10 years, there's really two key takeaway points from here. The first is that the median price has increased significantly, and as we saw in the graph previous, that's quite evident. But what's interesting is the spread of prices have increased. So the difference between the 25th and the 75th percentile pricing is much wider than what it used to be. Whereas if you go back to 2010, 2011, that pricing was very, very tight around the median price. So there was a very limited variation in the underlying market prices. So one of that variability in the market, if our traditional retailers, what they're doing is they're pricing that in as risk into fixed price contracts. And because that's priced in as a risk, it leads to the entire cost of a fixed price retail contract increasing because retailers obviously don't want to take any loss on that risk. However, if we flip this around and we talk about from a consumer perspective, what the spread in prices also represents is an arbitrage opportunity for customers who want to take control of their energy. So there is opportunity that comes through this variability. I'd like to dive into that further in the next slide. So this graph is an average day in the South Australian market. So these prices have been, for each hour, have been averaged over the last, for each year. And the orange line is what an average day in South Australia looked like back in 2010. And the aqua line is what it looked like this year to date, up until mid-November. And there's a couple of really massive differences you can see. So the first thing is that there's been that you can see that increase in spread. The difference between the lowest price point during the day and the highest price point is quite a lot larger than what it was in 2010. And obviously the entire market has moved up. And so the average is now higher than what it was 10 years ago. But if we look closer at the shape, we can also see that the shape has changed significantly. So we're seeing more ups and downs throughout the day, rather than a much flatter day with a rise in the peak. And that's very much been driven by the rise in renewables, particularly rooftop solar, which is helped bringing the demand and the price down during the middle of the day. And what's interesting is we can see in this peak window, we've shaded the region that is the traditional peak, so 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. And if you look at the price in the very middle of the day in 2019, we're seeing prices in the middle of the peak period at 12, 1, 2 p.m. that are actually lower than the off-peak rates in later than night. And this is an entirely new paradigm in the market that we've never seen before. And so when we talk about variability and taking advantage of that, this is what we're talking about. So to put a real example to this, we have a number of irrigation customers, and the traditional paradigm would be you never run your pumps, which use load, consume electricity during the middle of the day where possible, because the price is going to be higher than at night. So a lot of customers would run their pumps after 10 p.m. in that sort of off-peak evening window or early in the morning to capitalize on lower prices. But this graph is showing us that those customers would actually be better off running those pumps during the very middle of the day when the prices are lower. And this is quite a new concept. One thing we also wanted to touch on is with this spread and with this opportunity comes this even more unusual circumstance where we're seeing negative pricing in the market. So the underlying market can actually go negative. It can go all the way down to negative $1,000 per megawatt hour. But when that happens, if you're on a fixed price contract, traditional retailers are actually getting paid when the price is negative. They get paid to use energy, and they obviously don't pass it on to consumers. And historically, this only happened a handful of times during the year, and typically in very early hours of the morning when there is very low demand on the grid and there is an excess capacity of generation in the market. But what we've seen, driven by rooftop solar on residential homes and the increase in wind and solar at a grid scale, is we've seen not just an increase in the number of negative intervals or negative hours seen during the year, but we're seeing these negative periods happening right in the very middle of the day. If we look at 2019, we've seen at the peak, we've seen 44.5 hours of negative intervals at 1 p.m., which represents that an opportunity for customers who access the wholesale market can be paid to use electricity. And this is an entirely new way to look at that variability. And instead of seeing variability as risk, to see that variability as an opportunity to actually reduce your electricity costs.
And I think, Alex, to hammer home that point, it's at those very intervals and those periods of time that most consumers are being charged their higher price, their peak tariff or their peak rate. Yet the wholesale market is having these higher or increased frequency of negative price intervals.
Absolutely, we're not seeing that being passed on to consumers. Jamie, would you like to run us through some of the major changes in?
Yeah, certainly. So, obviously what we're seeing, why is the market changing? Very much around the fact that, as Alex said before, we've seen the coal power exiting the market. We've seen a number of policy changes. We've seen the fact that, this peak and off-peak concepts are very outdated. So these are things that are happening in the market. What we want to talk about is opportunities for customers to actually take advantage of this variability. As Alex said, how do we turn something that's traditionally looked at as a risk into an opportunity? And how do we use that to drive down energy costs? Well, there's probably three main areas, and we're going to deep dive into each of them. The first one is very much about looking at different contracting models. So let's move away from the fixed price, peak and off-peak pricing, and start to introduce concepts that have more dynamic pricing structures that align to what's going on in the market. So when these negative price events happen, that you as a consumer can actually take advantage of them. We also can talk about how do we actually enter and use renewables. There's a lot more renewable generation. You can get direct access to these both through on-site and off-site, and we'll again walk through how that actually works. And then the last one, what we really want to talk about today, is very much around how you can manage your energy. So if you have one of the previous two areas where you can actually take advantage of these lower prices or these negative price events, how do you actually make that real and make that and turn that into savings? A lot of people have this view that it's something major that you need to do in your organization. You need to stop producing everything in very short notice. Yes, that's part of it, but there's a lot more you can do at a very low level that actually can drive significant savings. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to pass over to Aidan, who's going to walk us through this in more detail.
Thanks, Jamie. So we sort of come at it from sort of three areas in terms of practically making it the market work for you in this new world order. The first one is around a dynamic solution and being sort of exposed or having access to that dynamic price, and we'll talk about how our products can support you there. The next piece is around direct access to generation, either virtually or physically, and there are benefits and savings to be had there. And then the third part is around really sort of taking advantage of those market swings through demand response, and various technology upgrades have allowed that, as Jamie mentioned. The first one is around this dynamic solution. We've made the point a few times, but talking about the market being broken when we talk about it in a standard peak and off-peak model. Perhaps in some regions you might also have a shoulder in there, but basically the shoulder is essentially a peak rate. That is quite clearly outdated with what's going on in the underlying market. There are alternatives. There is very granular time of use products available. In the flow power world, we have something called the price efficiency factor, which essentially looks at how you consume relative to the market. It's applied after the fact based on exactly how you consumed relative to exactly what happened in the market, and that starts to provide this access to unlocking some of these value streams that Alex touched on. Practically, what does that look like? And this is a chart that we saw a little bit earlier with that 2019 South Australian spot price year-to-date average. So you can see that the price shown on the left-hand side, dollars a megawatt hour, just divide by 10 if you're thinking around cents per kilowatt hour. So 100 becomes 10 cents a kilowatt hour. The grey shaded area is the typical peak and off-peak periods and estimated peak and off-peak rates for the South Australian market for 2019 are shown. And then over the top of that, we've laid a customer's consumption. This is a commercial business. I think it's a warehouse with a small retail front. And so you can see the typical hours of operation are from sort of 8 and 9 in the morning right up to 5 or 6, and that's a big sort of chunk of the middle of the day. So under the standard peak and off-peak model, this customer, if they have some ability to shift their load, consume the same amount but shift it forwards or back, are probably still trapped under the traditional model on that peak rate. Certainly, if they're able to consume a little bit earlier in the day, they may be able to switch from that peak rate at about 13 or 14 cents and push it down to that off-peak rate at 8 or 9. But if they were on a dynamic product and had access to time of use pricing through either price efficiency factor or some other model, they would essentially be moving from a price of 20 cents a kilowatt hour down to around 7 or 8 cents a kilowatt hour. So the savings there would be much more significant through a dynamic pricing structure. Not all businesses obviously can do this. I mentioned that there is some degree of, this customer is has a retail footprint, so you can't necessarily change your hours of operation, but there are small examples and small things that you can do that can have very significant impacts. For other businesses, we see, for example, customers who switch the time of use that they charge their forklift batteries. And indeed, if you're not using those assets during the middle of the day, plug them in over lunch and take advantage of the very cheap daytime pricing. Beyond being aware and having access to those dynamic prices, we talk about access to generation. We separate that into 2 buckets, but largely through our retail products, they can both work very similarly. Starting with the left-hand side of the screen, the off-site generation. This would be the power purchase agreement, the PPA in sort of common market language. And this is really around virtually taking access or buying a share of offtake from a wind or a solar plant. The typical, I suppose, characteristics of an off-site deal is that it is long-term, typically sort of 5 to 10 years in tenor, if not longer. Often it's at cheaper rates than what your retail contract costs today and below where the underlying market is, because you're essentially locking in a revenue stream and a customer offtake for these generators in order for them to get finance and to get built. In the flow power model, the sort of best practice is having access to 2 generation sources, both wind and solar. Typically can match the customer's profile best, so that you sort of have 1-to-1 or as close to 1-to-1 renewables versus customer load to give you that sort of better hedged performance. And then last but not least is obviously being able to integrate that virtual generation that's happening somewhere else in the state in which you operate into one single bill, and so just sleeve it through there and sleeve those electrons into your delivered price for your monthly billing cycle and make that all fairly neat. The second category is obviously on-site generation and storage. Typically, we see customers who probably only go after one generation technology. You're unlikely to have 2 sort of both wind and solar sitting behind the meter and on your site. It's not impossible, but it's quite rare. But increasingly, we are seeing interest in customers pairing these assets with storage as well, battery storage, or potentially even thermal storage to optimize their consumption.
And just to add to that, it's also doesn't have to be renewables. There's a lot of customers who have generators on site as well. And I guess the whole idea is, how do you make an asset that you have sit there that's typically there for security reasons or for continuity, business continuity, it becomes an asset that you can actually make money from, or use that to generate electricity and manage the high costs of that. So it doesn't actually have to be solar. It can also be things like you probably have assets already on site that you can use.
Yeah, absolutely. And essentially that's leading to reduced consumption and or potentially credits for the exports if you are generating over and above what your site is consuming at any given time. Last but not least, you obviously want a retail product that's flexible enough to sleeve all of these costs in and to incorporate that into the bill so that it's a simplified experience from a monthly perspective. So how does that look like in practical terms? And the schematic that we've got up is looking at the scenario when your consumption is greater than your virtual or on-site generation. And so we've got the virtual generation in the far left, we've got the customer consumption down in the bottom, and on-site generation and or storage feeding into the site. In this situation, the customer needs what's called balance of supply because the total generation, virtually or physically, is not enough to cover their consumption at any given point in time, and therefore they would be so-called importing from the wholesale market. And we have products that allow us to import from a couple of wholesale markets, be it the underlying spot price or from the ASX market. But you also want a product that's flexible enough to handle the rest of the time, and at different times renewable generation and or on-site generation may exceed your consumption. As Jamie mentioned earlier, some of these assets are scaled at their peak production to exceed customer usage, either the behind the meter assets or at any point in time your offsite or your virtual generation may exceed your consumption during very, very sunny periods of the day or very high wind output. And in the flow power model, you also have the ability to sell that back and gain credits for that as you export that into the wholesale market. So you really want a flexible retail solution that allows you to optimize and take advantage of these different value streams that are available, and that in a traditional retail model would be fixed and probably locked away behind a bundled price, whereby any of these benefits are being taken by the traditional retailer.
One of the things that we want to look at here is that there's two keys to demand response, demand management aspect is managing how you use energy, how you take advantage of that risk, that variability. And so demand response is about shaving off the big peaks. So really targeting the usage and the times you might respond in order to shave off the very, very large peaks that we see in the market, or to firm up renewable energy, renewable generation. If we look at 2019, and we've been talking about South Australia, this only represents 12 hours throughout the entire year. So it's very targeted and for quite small periods of time, and it can have very significant savings on the bill. The other thing that we often talk about is demand management. So we looked at the variability day to day, and we want to talk about how you can do small shifts to manage those load that take advantage of that price shape. And so by just shifting usage around when the peaks or the troughs of the market might be, you can unlock quite significant savings with a very small impact to how the overall business runs. And now we're going to look at a case study.
So I guess what we want to talk about now is making this real. So what we talked about, just to remind everyone, we talked a little bit about having commercial models that allow you to take advantage of the variability in the market. You're talking about how do we bring in generation assets, whether that's off-site renewables, on-site renewables, or physical assets that you might have like generators or battery storage. And then we talked about how do we want to make small changes in the way you use energy to actually try and drive out further cost savings over that other. So what we want to talk about is very simply is a case study. This is a real customer based in Victoria. They're an agriculture business, and they came and started talking to us in early 2017, and they've gone through a bit of a journey. And this is kind of why we really like this case study, is because it kind of emphasizes this point that this is a partnership, a long-term partnership journey that we go through together. It is not a procurement conversation where you're just trying to lock in the lowest rates. It very much is about understanding how you use energy and how can we manage that energy over time. So let's kind of jump to the next slide and we'll talk through it. So, you know, this, I guess, talks to itself to a certain degree. So early 2017, or the customer was currently on a fixed price contract, standard things, peak and off peak at around 12 cents. Again, not a really high rate. That's actually not bad for the size of business that they were. And we then looked at how we can introduce a more dynamic pricing model, a contract that allowed them to take advantage of that. By doing that alone and nothing else, we were able to kind of reduce them down to about 10.4 cents. And these are 2018 numbers. We then were able to kind of tie into offsite renewables, and this is the wind and solar, and blending wind and solar to actually match their load profile as best we can. Again, it's termed as we call it a virtual generation agreement. It's also known as a PPA. And by doing that, we were able to get them down to about 5.6 cents per kilowatt hour. But then when we actually worked with them and started looking at how and when they used business energy, we talked about they do pumping, but they do other things as well. And by adding in these demand management, both small things and by joining up on some of these larger programs, we're able to get them down to 4.4. And that's their number for their average for the entire year of 2018 was 4.4. So you can see the significant change is going from a 12 cents to 4.4. Obviously, that's a very good outcome, but we do expect that for almost every business that we can get somewhere in the order between 30 and 60% savings by just taking advantage of the variability. And I guess this is kind of where we wanted to kind of end it on, is just trying to, again, put the concept out there that there's been a lot in history that says that variability in the market is a bad thing, and it's risk, and it's not helping. What we're trying to highlight is that by understanding how the market moves and understanding how the variability works, you can actually use that variability to drive down your costs. And it's an area where sophisticated customers are actually making really significant savings. So I think we're going to call it at that. We're almost exactly at the half hour. So what we're going to do now is shift into questions. So for those who don't know, there's an ability in the webinar to type questions in. If you type them in, they'll come up to our moderator, and our moderator will put through those from there. So if you have any questions, please feel free to start putting them in. So let's start with one that's coming here. The first question is, my business has an inconsistent load and variable usage. Will it impact my PEF? And by that, they're referring to the dynamic measure that the commercial model allows them to have it. How does that actually work in practice? So maybe, Aidan, do you want to take us through that?
Yeah, sure. So as a reminder for anyone who missed the introduction of price efficiency factor in the earlier section, so really this is around customer consumption relative to market. Now, it's shape risk or shape load shape versus the market essentially. So, and remember that the chart that we were showing, the customer consumption versus the South Australian 2019 price shape. The price efficiency factor drops out of those two essentially. Now, varied load or varied usage is an interesting thing. Month over month change in total consumption is somewhat irrelevant to the price efficiency factor. It is the shape of your consumption that is more relevant. If you have varied consumption usage day over day, that will start to drive variability in your price efficiency factor. But if you have just simple changes in your seasonal consumption, i.e. you consume more in January and less in March or less in July, but it's generally still at the same times of the day, your price efficiency factor may not change significantly. It will come down to the shape of the wholesale market. So typically, by way of example, we see price efficiency factors within our portfolio across all states very close to 1 over the longer term. There is some seasonal variation naturally implicit in that. And you may see it flex slightly higher during summer, but we also have very good examples of customers who flex lower during summer when they take advantage of the high prices, either through demand management or demand response. And so they can actually see a significant improvement in their PEF at those high price times.
Another question here is, what if I can't change my operations? What are some examples of how I can improve my efficiency through demand management?
Great. So there are plenty of businesses that have a great deal difficulty in shifting operations around. There are a number of things that can help improve the PF, and a lot of those are about that, taking advantage of the on-site generation that might be available. So we've seen customers with significant solar installed, either ground mount or on the roof, will have a significant lowering of demand, which will improve your PF significantly, because it's happening at the peaks of when you're typically using operations under that solar curve. A lot of our customers have installed generators, diesel generators, which are relatively low in cost, when, particularly as the newer generation of diesel gensets, and those can help avoid those shifting to that diesel backup generator during the high price periods. Can have a huge impact on the price efficiency factor with only a limited number of hours of running. So with only having to run the generator for sort of half a dozen to a dozen hours during a year, those can be some really significant things that can be done if you don't have flexibility in your when you use electricity.
So just moving on then, well, we have a question also that kind of says, can we be more specific about some of the things that we did with the case study in particular to drive it down? And the question's referring to the fact that they're a large 24/7 operation. And obviously this is quite normal for a lot of the businesses that we deal with. We have quite a lot, not only in agriculture, but in manufacturing and in various elements. So do you want to just touch base on what we did for the specific case study?
Yeah, sure. So this specific case study was an agricultural customer. So a lot of their usage is from pumping loads, and they have in this case there's two sets of pumps. So they pump water from a river up to a dam where they then can store water, and then they have pumps that go from the dam out to the irrigation lines to water their crops. Now, there's a fair bit of flexibility in when those river pumps are used. The river pumps are very large, they use a large amount of electricity, but so long as there's sufficient storage in the dam, there's a great deal of flexibility over when those river pumps are run. Now, they put automation using the K-Watch controller, which is technology that FlowPower has, so that can be remotely controlled and monitored, and those river pumps can only be run when the price is lowest, and avoid using those pumps during higher prices. On top of that, typically this customer, depending on the time of year, might run a 2 or a 3 shift cycle. So they do different lots of watering during the day. And so shifting when that watering is done to work around those large peaks has a big impact. So if they know that there's a peak coming in the market, they can delay the start of the next shift by 1 or 2 hours and push that back, and that is one way that they can be flexible in how they do their operations.
Great. Why don't we take it just a little bit further, if we can, and just explain a little bit about some of the pool monitoring services and how that integrates with our K-Watch controller, just to make it kind of more real, because a lot of the questions that we've seen really focused around that you as a customer are not watching the market. You don't know what's going on, and part of that is really, that's the job of the retailer, and what we want to try and do is making that easy for customers to take advantage. So do you want to quickly run us through that as well?
Certainly. So FlowPower, we have what we call our market monitoring service. So FlowPower keeps a dedicated team of staff that are monitoring the market 24 hours a day, and seeing what the predicted prices are going to be, looking out for any particularly high spikes in the market that very commonly happen during summer, but could also happen sometimes early in the morning in winter. And as part of that, we then, if we see that these spikes might be coming in the market, we'll be sending out notifications to all of our customers on that service to advise them that there is going to be a change in operations required. And with that, then customers have a couple of choices as whether they can either sort of manually make adjustments to how they perform that. So whether they want to go and shut down equipment in response to that, or move shifts and operations around based on that. But we also, as mentioned with these river pumps for this agricultural customer, we have a box called the K-Watch controller, that we can install on site and connect to various pieces of equipment, and we can control that with customer permission to switch off equipment on site to reduce load during those high prices. So that can be done quite rapidly within 5 or 10 minutes of a known price spike, and then switch back on efficiently. So by utilizing that automated service, customers can focus on just the operations and not having to worry about what the market are doing, and can rely that someone is there looking out and making sure that the spikes of the market are avoided.
Excellent. And just to remind everyone, what we're talking about there is very much the demand response side of things, which is an event-driven conversation, which happens, and again, in South Australia, there was 12 hours last year that this relates to. So we're not talking a lot of time, and we're seeing that customers who are able to do that for those type of things are able to make savings in excess of 10% of their entire bill over that same period. So doing small things or doing things for a small number of hours can have a very significant impact. Okay, there's the next question here. One of the questions that came up said, as prices are low in the middle of the day due to renewables, why does Flow Power routinely publicize a high price during this period? Flow Power has a number of different models, and again, the purpose here is not to really push our models, but really to talk about, we have ones where you're directly exposed to the wholesale market. We have ones where you are semi-exposed to the market, where we would give fixed prices and then use this price efficiency factor to basically match the shapes in there. Obviously, it depends on the risk profile, and it depends on how it fits together. So for us, we absolutely 100% believe that you should be rewarded for doing things, and all of our products, every single one of them, has a mechanism in place so that if you are able to shift load and manage things into times when the market is actually at its lowest, that you get the full pass through of that, obviously depending on what you do and what the underlying contract is. So even when we have a price that's fixed for the period, there's mechanisms in place to make sure that if you're able to make savings or do things during those periods, that you get fully rewarded for that. So here's a question. What is the advantage of implementing battery storage, and what's our view on batteries longer term?
All right, I can take this. So batteries are fantastic. They obviously serve, the advantages of batteries is they're small, they're essentially, well, as green as the electricity that's coming out of the grid. They take up they don't make noise, and they're very easy to integrate into a site, and they're very, very rapid in their response. So they can switch near instantly, so huge advantages that they can offer with that speed of response, and they can obviously be charged off solar from the roof, which further lowers the cost. So there's a large number of advantages to batteries. The challenge right now is batteries are still very, very expensive. Anyone who's looked at purchasing one will see that they're anyone struggling to make them cost competitive unless there's typically some form of government money available in the form of a grant. But the cost curve of batteries is dropping very, very rapidly. And we're going to see a huge increase in the number of batteries on customer sites over the next couple of years, and in 5 to 10 years, I think we'll see them largely replace diesel generators at customer sites in almost all cases, which is going to allow those customers to take absolute advantage of those underlying market prices and those signals that they represent. The other advantage from a battery is if you're seeing negative or extremely low prices during the day, if you charge the battery at those times, you're essentially, if the price is $0 or less, then you're not paying for electricity, or you're getting paid to charge your battery, which is a really significant piece. So anyone with batteries right now is already starting to take advantage of that shifting curve, and that's only going to continue in the future.
Well, we're getting to the end of the presentations and the time, so I'm wondering if anyone wants to ask any more questions. We're getting pretty close to the end, so let's just answer one more question. What changes are we expecting to occur in the NEM in the next few years, and how will it affect my electricity bill? So really kind of come back to what do we think is actually happening, and where is this going to go from here?
Billion-dollar question, Jamie, billion-dollar question. All of the changes that Alex highlighted and talked about in the first section of the presentation and the opportunities that we are talking about are very new. The market is in as big a transitional phase through the penetration of behind-the-meter renewables and utility-scale renewables and the retirement of thermal plants on the scale we've not seen before. Throwing over the top of that, better educated consumers and market, technology uptake in terms of everyone sort of being able to track the wholesale price and equipment on site being able to respond to price signals, etc. And we are really transitioning very quickly in New World Order. So I would expect that we will continue to see these opportunities that we're talking about, low daytime prices, volatility being pushed to the shoulders of the day in terms of evening and maybe even morning around the onset of solar as the sun wakes up and disappears beyond the horizon. That trend, we haven't seen the peak of it yet because both consumers and generators are still getting used to that new world order. But at some point in time, with enough change in behaviour, with enough batteries charging during the middle of the day, things will start to tip the other way. So it's very difficult to say exactly over what time frame this is going to happen. It's very difficult to say exactly how deep the daytime price discounts are going to get and how long they'll last within the minimum and maximum of the market price. I suppose that's going to be our constraints. But certainly this market is in transition, and I would say no one necessarily has all the answers, but we are seeing, without doubt, a more dynamic market. We are seeing more and more opportunities for customers and consumers to be exposed and to take advantage of those fluctuations. And that's all before we even consider that the underlying market is moving to a 5-minute settlement in the next couple of years, and we expect to see more coal plant retirements, which will continue to challenge on the supply side. So certainly much more opportunities moving forward. Timeframes remain very uncertain.
Well, thanks for that. And thank you all for joining us today. I think we're going to wrap it up at this point. Just remind you that this presentation and recording will be on our website and on our YouTube channel. Feel free to go to either one of those and watch some of the other ones as well. We wish you a good new year and a happy seasons coming forward. And if you'd like to talk about anything more, feel free to give us a call, and we're happy to kind of connect you up with the relevant experts in this. So once again, thanks to my co-presenters, and thanks to you for listening, and have a great festive season coming forward. Thanks, and have a great day.